joining us. We are running another webinar this afternoon as part of our series of webinars that are making up our curriculum, and it's a growing curriculum, and we're continuing to recruit for volunteers from our state and territory data management teams, our chief data officers, and our corporate partners, as well as we are also including faculty from universities and other expertise centers on data management to bring you the very best we can in the way of content to help you build your data management programs within state and territorial government. We are anchoring all of these webinars on the data management, the DAMA International data management body of knowledge, and that data management body of knowledge is now in a version 2 as of last summer. But as Elena, our guest speaker today, has said, governance is still in the middle, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. I want to remind everyone that the top 10 strategies and the top 10 technologies both include the priority of data management. So within the top 10 strategies, data management and analytics is number 8. And then the second top 10 we always publish is on technologies, applications, and tools. Data management is number 6, and business intelligence is number 5. So this is a high priority for states. You will see we have been addressing data management in the last 3 annual surveys, and based on what we're hearing from CIOs, we're offering you these webinars. Our guest speaker today is Elena Scoop. Elena is a great contributor to NASCIO's data management working group. She has helped us with a number of publications, but she has worked in data management within the state for 25 years. She has amazing background in both government as well as industry, but she's worked with technology. She's worked with technology and business leaders in data governance, data management, including data security and privacy, business intelligence reporting design, and data migration strategies. She's implemented data governance and data stewardship programs and processes throughout her career, and she's delivered on large projects and received several leadership awards. She's previously presented at DAMA International in Minnesota, IT Government Symposiums, the Digital Summit, and more. So we are very pleased to have Elena here to speak to us. So I'm going to turn this over to you, Elena. Thank you for coming and speaking to us today.
You're welcome, and thank you for having me. I know everybody's busy. As Eric said, my name is Elena Scope, and I'm assuming everyone wants to hear about how we're making this shift from IT to business data governance. Before I get started, I had a quick question for someone if they want to answer. Where did data governance kind of come out of? Does anyone know or want to speak briefly to? You can unmute and speak if you like. No one? Hello, is anybody there?
Yeah, everyone's here. We're still here.
Okay. So, as you may know, data governance generally kind of came out of the necessity for database design and data integration, physical data elements, DBA, and DB admin needed help. So one of the ways that they kind of implemented that, and I don't know all of the history, is kind of building out some kind of IT data governance structure. And that was okay. I mean, it was really good. A lot of it has value, especially because it kind of gave birth to data dictionaries and those those types of things. The other part that happened with what I call IT data governance is that it actually focused, of course, on IT in the sense that when IT got in the room with the business, they were speaking of the physical databases and the physical structures, and the business was trying to kind of communicate the requirements. So sometimes there was a disconnect in the communication, and so there was a need for both the business, for the physical IT piece, but there's also a need for kind of the business. And of course, I have now the DMBOK Wheel 1.0 up. I know that we're now working on the 2.0, which has been published. I've taken a peek at it. But in both of them, data governance, of course, is in the center. And again, it focuses, in the second one, it does do a little bit more focus on data integration and, storage, data modeling and security and those types of things. So, in my opinion, and I don't remember, I apologize, I need to find out where I got this quote from, but basically data is not governed, but the people's behavior around how we manage data is governed. So how you're doing the work in the systems and behind the scenes is an important aspect, but how you build in controls and decision making as part of that data lifecycle is very important. So I think that most of the work and behind the scenes in the physical databases and design and security and metadata and data warehousing and business, all of that is all important. But what's also happening is this national trend around, especially within the public sector, to deliver almost one-stop shop type of services and demanding these services from government instead of course, a lot of services were built out of what I call assembly lines. So you fill out a form and then you take it to this department and then it goes. So you have this assembly line process within government services as opposed to you do a transaction and then it kind of disperses to the various areas that needs to have something happen to that transaction. So it's not single-threaded. So both our citizens and even our government agencies are requiring that we kind of refine how those processes work. And there's been a lot of work over the past years to refine and consolidate and have digital downloadable apps that, provide government services, and that's great. But you still have to figure out how you're going to govern that, how you're going to govern in this new way of how we're providing services to both our partners and to our citizens. So what I want to talk about is kind of making that shift from where IT governance kind of came out of to actually where the governance, data governance has, I feel, the biggest impact. A lot of times when I was working as a data architect and trying to get business requirements from the business, they would ask questions like, well, where's the, who's the authoritative source and who's responsible for the design and how we know we're getting the right data in the right place at the right time. And IT can answer that question to the best of their ability, but the people that could really answer that question are on the business side because they know the processes. IT might know where the data lands and maybe sometimes what happens to it. I'm going to stop there and see if there's any quick questions before we move on. No? Then I will continue. So what I want to talk about is 3 stories, short stories of how data governance was implemented here in the state of Minnesota in various structures. So we're not done, meaning that all the agencies don't have data governance. So let me be clear about that. But there are kind of pockets of how data governance is kind of emerging and helping to really leverage data as an enterprise asset. So we're going to cover three. One is we're looking at Minnesota Department of Transportation. It's at the enterprise level. And when I mean enterprise within MnDOT, not enterprise within the state of Minnesota. Then we're going to talk about how it was done at the project level for Department of Natural Resources. And then we're going to talk about the Olmstead plan, which was a cross-agency collaboration. So it included more than one agency around data governance. So the enterprise for MnDOT, they started out way back in 2008, and I put the timeline up here because when they did it on the enterprise level, they started out really with building a business plan, and it took them a couple of years from the plan to actually start looking at ways that they can implement the plan in 2011, and then in 2016, they had a data governance effective program that was evolving. The key thing I want to point out with what MnDOT did was they actually, part of how they implemented some of this is that they used like what they call a business data catalog, which started to catalog business definitions. And I thought that was very significant. They also, when they said enterprise, they meant enterprise. So it was basically at the top, you had 15 assistant commissioners, you had 9 MnDOT managers, and over 90 subject matter experts throughout MnDOT. Now, I will say one of the reasons why I think for MnDOT, why this was an easier thing to do, even though they did it over multiple years, I think it was like 8 years, 6, 7 years, because their organization, in my opinion, of engineers. You've got a lot, they're used to dealing with standards and structures and those types of things. So the concept for governing the data was not too far-fetched for them. However, they did have some challenges, and but they worked through them, and now they're now working on how to maybe collaborate with other agencies. But I think that they did a really good job. They're rocking and rolling. They also had gotten the business leaders involved at the beginning, and they leveraged data scientists, which we don't talk about enough, especially in government. And they're included in all projects and initiatives as part of the review. So they have actually been embedded as part of the culture of MnDOT when it comes to some of these projects and initiatives. And the new business role that they've defined were the data scientists, and they used, similar to kind of what they have the librarians and their role and how they help them to navigate through subject area definitions was key because they actually used basically the way that they do it at the library. So if it's the subject area, it's that way for a reason, and that is the structure and format that they used, and it really helped the business to move to the next piece. And finally, governance was basically embedded in the processes that it needed to be embedded in. So again, it took quite a bit of time and over some years, but it took persistence and perseverance, and that's that. So I'm going to pause there to see if anyone has any questions about the MnDOT Enterprise Initiative.
Okay, and I'm looking at chat to look for those questions coming across. And while we're waiting a little bit here, Elena, I've got a question for you. Within Minnesota Department of Transportation, if you go back one slide to slide 12, something that you put as bullet number 1, business leaders involved. did you have someone specific within MnDOT who was a champion for this, or maybe you had more than one champion? And did you have another champion within either the governor's cabinet or the state CIO, commissioner? Who was the one carrying the banner on this?
Actually, it was the enterprise architect over at MnDOT. And then he engaged one of his IT leaders, and then they brought in some business leaders to collaborate for the MnDOT one.
Yeah, good. All right. No questions coming through on chat, so we can keep going, Elena. Yeah. Very good.
So where are we? Number 2, DNR Project Approach. So DNR, they found out that they were under a tight timeline to get something done that was mandated by Governor Mark Dayton. So they needed to come up with the buffer initiative, landmark buffer initiatives. And for those of you that don't know what that is, it's just like this 50-foot kind of, I think, gap between the property and along the rivers that would buffer and would filter out phosphorus and nitrogens on property. So the DNR was responsible for producing these maps of public waters and ditch systems that was required under the new law. So local governments will provide information on ditches, which the DNR will integrate with information on public waters developed in preliminary buffer maps. So several things needed to happen. They needed to figure out, okay, how are we going to publish this data if we didn't know what was the right data? Also, they needed to understand quickly who was going to be accountable and responsible for these data sets, because they were going to also have to collaborate with GIS, and these things would be embedded into their like the GPS map, so that this information had to be correct. And also to make sure that they're not disclosing non-public information, because some of these buffer streams were on private property. They needed to make sure that none of that information was part of what got out. So they felt like this particular project was a good candidate to start working with, to creating data stewards and appoint them to at the county and city level. Because the data quality was key, they made a recommendation that they needed to have someone accountable should things go sideways. So that worked. And they leveraged the business leaders and data stewards. They didn't have data stewards at the time. They had what we call de facto stewards. So they had someone, okay, you contact Jerry over in Anoka County and he'll give you the data set. Okay, well, Jerry or Jerry's boss is now the data steward. And they just kind of had to go through and figure out what were the quality measures and so forth for all of these. So we had to deal with all of the counties throughout the entire state of Minnesota. And now the business data governance is becoming part of the fabric now. Although you're thinking that maybe because the data set person is the steward, it's not. The person that's accountable is that business leader's boss, who's part of a process of how they maybe pull that information together. So in some counties it was in IT, and others, because they're small counties, they had they wear multiple hats, so it's the business and IT, but we still needed to make sure that there was someone that was accountable. Questions before I go on?
I don't see anything coming across on chat yet, Elena, but we could ask the question, how much involvement did the governor have, given that you were tying into one of the governor's initiatives? Did he attend any of your workshops, sessions, or any actual physical presence there, or any of his staff, like a chief of staff being there during this initiative?
Not for this. I mean, they had people from DNR that would report to the governor's office as far as the status and how it was coming along. DNR went and DNR worked with GIS, and I know that there were periodic meetings about it because he was, he was on the hook to make sure that this kind of got out there. And I do know that there was kind of some early testing before it was actually launched. And I don't know if you all remember, but remember way back when they were doing the whole open data and from the White House down to the various states, I think that as a result of the buffer maps, they're now located on the federal site for all of the buffer streams for Minnesota. So you can go through Minnesota, I think, Commons, and you can also go through the federal website and get and download a lot of the data that is public. But to answer your question, no, only in that they got periodic updates as to how it was coming along.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Did you see have you had any contacts with other states or territories that have wanted to copy or mimic either one of the first two use cases that you've presented here, either the MnDOT or the DNR one?
Not yet, but I'm getting requests to come and talk to people about some of this because they're very different approaches, but they all have in common that they started with the business, they started with the business problem, and then they brought in the IT piece as a partner. The way I look at it is the IT role in this is more of a supporting character as opposed to the character, so we would facilitate a lot of this, but not necessarily lead in the sense that we would own it. They needed to own it, so they needed to identify.
Which is the whole point of your presentation,
Exactly.
Moving governance over to the business. Very good.
Exactly.
No other questions coming across on chat, so we might as well move ahead, Elena. Thank you.
So this one I found the most, for me, one of the most interesting because this created a very interesting challenge, which is a cross-agency initiative. This means that this was an initiative that came out of Minnesota had Better Minnesota for Citizens Council, where they kind of, okay, what are the things that we can do to make Minnesota better? It's something that Governor Dayton had also put together. And they had all these different initiatives, and one of the things that kind of grew out of that was, okay, well, we should do enterprise data governance if we want to do manage our data better. Well, cabinet level members, felt, and rightfully so, well, if you try to do something statewide, that means we would have to take the 76 executive branch agencies along with counties and cities and implement, which can be daunting. It will probably implode on itself if you go that large out of the gate. So what they did was someone proposed, well, let's start with something small. What is an initiative that's going on in the state right now where we would probably need to figure out ways to share information or measurements that involve more than one agency. And one of the things that came up was the Minnesota Olmstead Plan, which was a comprehensive plan. First of all, anybody know what the Olmstead Plan is? Before I go on, I'm not talking about Olmstead County because people make that mistake all the time.
Yeah, that is something we're not familiar with. So please explain what that is.
So it's part of kind of the ADA, America for Disabilities Act, where back in 1999 there was a federal lawsuit around people being restrained in correctional facilities longer than they needed to be because they couldn't find housing, and usually this was done for people with disabilities. So there was a law that was put in place that, and if you read the statute in ADA, it talks about Government should provide the same services for people with disabilities that don't have disabilities. So the Olmstead plan, which really kind of turns some of the agencies on its head. So now you're saying I'm not supposed to provide, I'm supposed to do things in a very different way than I'm used to doing it. Also to provide choices for people with disabilities. A lot of the services and programs in Department of Human Services and other Department of Health and so forth, it's more around these are the things you do and do not qualify for. Therefore, you do not have a choice. So you cannot work because you're disabled. That's not necessarily true. You cannot live where you want to because you have a disability. That's not true. So what all the states have had to do this is that they had to come up with a plan to figure out how they were going to implement this new law within their agencies. How are they going to work together to provide better services for people with disabilities, which actually at the end of the day is for all citizens. So that's what the Minnesota Olmstead plan is. So each agency, and not only do they have to come up with the plan, they are monitored by the courts, and they have to report to the courts quarterly or periodically as to how they're coming along with these plans that they said that they were going to do to make this better. So, questions before I go on about this?
I don't see anything coming across on chat, so let's keep going. We'll keep an eye on for your questions coming through on chat, everyone. Please use the chat to everyone for any questions or comments. Thank you.
So, of course, so the Better Government for Minnesotans, they said, well, let's look at the Olmstead plan and see how we can maybe build governance around maybe just one area. So, okay, that sounds good. But then, of course, the question is, if you're talking about a few agencies, what about the data, right? Are we measuring the right things, and are our citizens better served by not sharing this information? I'm not talking about the non-public information. So they wanted to come up with a system for interagency system so that they can share information. Well, how are you going to build governance, or how are you going to share the data if you don't have any kind of governance in place? So the problem was that they needed to figure out, okay, where was the authoritative source going to be? What is the information? But before we can define even what the authoritative source was going to be, we needed to define what are the pieces of information that we collectively as agencies needed or felt like we should share, and even if we couldn't share, that we were consistently measuring. And so they wanted to build this system thinking that that would solve the problem. So we just started with within people with disabilities across all services. Let's look at just employment data, the subject area. So they wanted to build a system, they wanted to do this analysis, and we had DEED, we had DHS, and education. So all three of these agencies, this is what was done initially before data governance was brought in. So they did this analysis, and anyone who's done analysis, you can go into analysis paralysis. So they wanted to add data elements. It just went on and on. There was gaps in the data. There were many questions that asked for more questions, and at this part of the process, the business folks weren't necessarily involved. These were kind of the IT systems folks, and I mean, they had a wealth of knowledge. A nice document came out around the analysis of, you know, what data existed, what data didn't exist within the agencies, which makes sense because based on programs and program criteria, you're not collecting certain data the same way. For example, Department of Human Services would not necessarily be collecting wage data because the idea in the past has been you wouldn't necessarily be working, and if you were working, the data wouldn't necessarily be clean. The source of that would be DEED, which is Department of Employment and Employment, Economic Employment. Sorry, I'm used to the acronym. So they would have a lot of the wage information and data around employment and wages. But if you're working with people with disabilities, and some of them may be in living housing that provides subminimum wage, and you want to manage or at least look at what that wage data looks like and how they can lift that up, then it was just they didn't have that data. So we had to figure out how to bring the three together. So they realized that in creating this system, starting at the system just to look at employment data, the plan was, because the analysis took so long, that they needed a new plan. So as a result of that, we brought in the data governance group, which was me, and we brought in the leadership of the three agencies to start having this conversation about employment. We needed to identify the decision-making structure. We needed to figure out a data sharing approach and requirements and decision on data sources. Now, the leadership group didn't necessarily need to do that. Once we had what the requirements were from the decision makers and their program leaders, defining the data sources and definitions was a lot easier. So let's see, I'm going to stop here. Someone had a question about, were you able to come up with standards for your data elements? Yes, actually, once we got to this point where we had identified the leaders, they identified, I guess, their surrogates or their delegates, and you got down to, but the leaders defined those definitions, and we came up with common data elements as far as what they meant on the business side. On the system side, it was a different story, meaning that now that we understood, and I'll give you benefits as a very good example, which is because it's one of the ones that came up in the conversation. Well, when I'm talking to Department of Human Services, to them benefits are medical benefits. In the Department of Employment, benefits are employment benefits. And in other cases, benefits meant both, medical and employment benefits. So we had to clarify what that was, which meant that then when they go to the system, either they need to make sure that it's named correctly on the back end, or that they have a way to maybe track what that definition is. And they haven't done that. They haven't gotten that far, but at least now they know because it is being documented. But that's a great question. And then someone asked, how did you handle master data management to get the gold record for a person? Well, within the agency, they already kind of have that defined. When we were talking about across agencies, it's different because until you enter into data sharing agreement, and I'll get into that in a minute, that is a difficult thing to do. There have been times where they have been able to do that, but in the gold record, what do you mean? I guess I'm not clear on what the gold record for a person is. Is that a clean record, a scrubbed record?
Lauren's coming through on that response, but typically what we've talked about with a gold record would be, now this is one perspective, and Lauren's just responded, but a person, a single view of the person across the enterprise, and that would become relevant here because you're going cross-agency, so you've got more than one agency involved here, Elena. Yes. Is there a single person view, no matter, so the agencies are sharing a quote-unquote enterprise or cross-agency view of the person. So when I'm talking about Elena Scope over in Health and Human Services. I'm also talking about I could share that information or be talking to someone over in revenue, and we're both talking about the same Elena Scope.
Yeah, no, that's not what they considered a clean. I mean, that is a definition of a clean record, but that is not one of the outcomes of the data governance work that took place.
Okay.
And here's why. They needed to report on employment. They needed to report on numbers. They didn't have to go to the individual person. If we have to report to the courts, you cannot disclose a lot of that non-public information. What you can report on is what you mean by employment, what you mean by if they're employed consistently, if they're advanced in employment. So the agencies came up with what those definitions were from a reporting standpoint. So whether they could share that information or whether they needed to report on them within their agencies, they were all consistently reporting with using the same set of criteria. They didn't have to have the single view of the individual in order to, because then that's a whole nother role where someone is actually analyzing, and that needs to be embedded within the programs. They want to get to that, but they're not quite there yet. They were hoping that they could get something like that right now, but again, because Minnesota has one of the very strong data practices laws, it takes a while to do the data sharing agreement so that that can happen. However, what this sets us up for is to be able to do that because we've done a lot of the due diligence, and now the next piece is, okay, are you okay with us sharing this information? Legislators, yes. Okay, now we know what the requirements are. Now we can actually go and build the system or bring that information together, and we've built the infrastructure to do that. So it actually makes it a lot easier. Does that answer the question, Eric?
Very good. Thank you. And keep those questions coming in, folks, on chat. We'll be watching for them. Thank you.
So because the various agencies, of course, they have different structures, so trying to line up leadership and decision makers with the knowledge workers and steering was a little bit of a challenge at first because how they're lined up on the education is different than how they had them lined up at DEED and lined at Department of Human Services, because there's also the agencies are different sizes. So the first thing that I actually needed to do was to have conversations with the leadership to help them understand what type of people we needed to have in these roles, what kind of work they were going to do, what kind of decisions we would need them to make, and we would want their surrogates to make maybe on their behalf. And that was very important in trying to build the structure around especially the cross-agency data governance. And when we also talk about, for example, a single definition, well, there's no such thing when you're dealing with multiple agencies because some of their definitions came out of regulations, they came out of statute, so you can't change them. But what you can do is understand what they are and agree, okay, we're going to adopt this reporting period the way employment does because they go quarterly and they're always a quarter in arrears, for example. We're going to make sure that when we talk about benefits that we qualify it with medical benefits, dental benefits, employment benefits across the agency so that they're clear so when we report on it, then we're consistent. The one thing so that was one of the key pieces that we had to kind of work through, and it was really an education piece because people thought, oh, well, you're talking about data governance, then I need to go bring my data person in. I actually recommended that they not bring their data person in the first couple of workshops because we would go down that rabbit hole, and I wanted to keep the focus on the business leaders, hearing what their stories were, hearing where their what their barriers were, because that was important. Because what happens, especially, and I'm a data person, so I'm talking about myself. When you get a data person in a room, we want to jump right to the details. And sometimes then we lose that connection with that conversation with the business person. And so then you get a differing degree of clarity and definitions when you're looking at requirements and trying to pull this data together, whether it's for reporting, whether it's for transactional purposes, providing services, analysis, for whatever. So this was an important piece in setting up the structure. When I brought the group together from the various agencies, and it wasn't a large group, when I brought them together and we were having a conversation, they thought it was very important to make sure that they had a C-level, meaning a CIO or assistant commissioner, deputy commissioner at their agency, that if we came to, we couldn't agree or what needed direction, that we could escalate. And putting that in place first was very important. And it seemed like from that point, the groups came together and they trusted, because I said, I hear you, we'll get this in place. The decision makers don't necessarily need to come to the meetings. We'll call them together when we're at an impasse or when we need their direction. Other than that, they let the business leaders and the knowledge workers kind of help make sure that things were moving along in the data governance world, which I thought was really good. I'm going to stop there for a second to see if anyone has any questions. Excuse me.
While we're looking for questions on chat, I'll ask a question. To prepare these agencies, and you've got multiple agencies here, to participate the way you want them to or wanted them to, did you have preliminary workshops? Did you have a marketing plan? Did you go see these people individually? How did you prepare them to participate, Elena?
So I think the pre-planning work was absolutely important. One of the things after we found out, okay, these are the leaders you need that would participate, a lot of them really hadn't heard what data governance is and so forth, but I also wanted to talk to them individually before I brought them together. So I actually set up one-on-one conversations with each of the leaders, or had small group conversations with each of the leaders individually and at the agencies before I brought them together. I wanted to hear their story. I wanted to hear what their barriers are, so I could see and educate them on, okay, that we'll address that in this workshop, or we'll address that as part of this governance. And other parts was outside of the realm of what we needed to do. It was very important to me that we had these conversations earlier. I had these conversations with them. For example, one of the leaders said that they wanted to just tell the story once as far as how this data was being reported across the agencies. Another one, that it was important that the information was accurate, because not only do we have to report it state, we have to report it to at the federal level. So, and then another one says we want to be able to, we do want to be able to share this information so that we can help us inform what policies we might need to change, what programs we might need to change. Okay, so we're working on that as well. And understanding that piece of it, it's like, okay, then you need to bring the people that are familiar with your programs into the room. And at some point, not now, at some point we will bring the data people in. In the initial meeting, when I brought everyone together, I had the data people in there because I wanted them to hear what the leaders wanted to say, and have them understand what their perspective was. And I made it very clear that you are here to observe, and we would have a secondary meeting to kind of bring and have those conversations. And that was very, very important. And it helped me to build out how we facilitated the future workshops. And it helped me to learn about the programs as well as them learning about data governance without having to understand it in a big room of, of 100 people. So they felt more comfortable as we started working together, and I think that was very important. But thank you for that question.
Was there any concern or resistance to accepting this new role? Because it looks like you've done something new with the business side, establishing governance and the movement of that emphasis from IT to the business. Were they willing to accept this readily, or did you have to convince them or make a strong marketing plan and help them see the value of that change?
I did not have to make a strong marketing plan. I think just having a one-on-one conversation with them and having them ask me questions helped to ease their minds about their willingness to accept the role that they're about to embark in. And I told them that I would do as much as I could to kind of help navigate, because this was a new thing for them. But what was really interesting, an aha moment for me, was when they realized that what they were getting has been something they've been asking for. Because some of them were really frustrated that it seems like some of the requirements will come, well, this is what the system can do, as opposed to asking the question, what is it I need to have happen? So coming at it from the business side instead of being locked into what the existing requirements are in their system, really gave them a new sense of freedom of, oh, so we can like rewrite the world if you wanted to. I mean, not to that extreme, but
yeah,
I think that a lot of times we start on the IT side instead of on the business, and they were welcoming the idea of having this business conversation just about this one subject area, employment, with the other agencies in the room. They needed to understand, oh, this is why D does it this way. Oh, this is why we do it this way. And, okay, so this is why we can or can't build a cross-agency system. Because it was assumed that they would be able to build one out of the gate, which is not possible for now because of data practices laws.
Mm-hmm.
So
now, you leveraged the Olmstead plan. Were there any other statewide programs, either from the governor or commissioner level, that you leveraged in this program to get participation, buy-in from both the members of these agencies, but maybe even support from cabinet members?
Well, because it came out of the Better Minnesota for Minnesotans cabinet that Governor Mark Dayton had put together, and the recommendation came out of that group, they weren't necessarily involved, but they gave direction to IT, and we partnered with Department of Admin so that it wasn't so IT-ish. So we had not cabinet level, but CIO level partnering at the top to kind of make this, help shepherd this and champion this through. And I think that was also key, because if it was just IT, if it was just MnDOT, then I think it would be very, very different. But if you are partnering with another agency on the business side, and they were a neutral partner in the sense that we partner with the agency that actually deals with data practices policy. So that gave them comfort that in doing this, we were going to be good stewards and making sure we keep your data private and make sure we're following all of those privacy laws, which gets to some of the roles that was kind of different in how we put this data governance group together. So we included the program managers, agency program directors, assistant and deputy commissioners, but we also included a role that we don't normally have at the table at the commissioner and deputy commissioner level, which is your data practices and compliance person. your agency attorney or legal attorney and data practices person, your agency policy expert, so they might not understand maybe all the processes, but they know all of the ins and outs of all of their policies within the program. And we also did include the data systems managers or subject matter expert in particular data systems. So, which is kind of a different, so you have more of a business side conversation around, okay, so we can come up with these definitions. Oh, we have the data practices for person in the room, a legal, a compliance person. Are we able to share this information? Can we share this information? So you're having these simultaneous conversations that really tells you, okay, then maybe we need to look at changing policy or make recommendations to change policy or make recommendations to change statutes at the business level before you even start looking and building a system, which was key, which was very important. So I thought that the data practices folks and our agency data sharing attorneys and so forth, they were also a part of the data governance conversation because a lot of this stuff gets into data sharing, not just across agencies, but sometimes within the agency. So we had legal folks from all three of the agencies as well. So they understood. We came up with kind of a streamlined process because their processes were, each agency does it different. Well, why not figure out how we start cataloging some of this information, so every time we have to go through this analysis or governance, that we can go somewhere and see where it started and who we can talk to say, hey, can you come? We're about to do this. But to answer one of your other questions, yes, I just thought of the Office of Higher Ed brought me in to help them take their data governance, help them implement their data governance because they were kind of stalled. And now they actually have their structure and they're rocking and rolling and they have business people and they did a enterprise, but higher ed is a smaller agency, so it was easier to implement an enterprise data governance structure within that one agency. But it took me about 6 months to do that. They now have a data strategy plan. They have who they're on their top leadership, who their decision makers are, and it's pretty good. So, questions about the roles, because I found this was very interesting as far as pulling this, balancing the business leaders with the policy and compliance piece and the data systems folks. I made for some really rich conversation, which was, rich. When I say rich, I mean it was very, I learned a lot from a both policy and program and compliance standpoint, things you don't necessarily see in the systems. So.
Okay.
And the last thing is, I think I've mentioned this, that the items that each of them had is that they engaged and had business leaders engaged, and this is for all three, for both for MnDOT, for DNR, and for the cross-agency. IT didn't drive it, but facilitated the outcomes. The new roles identified and were embedded as part of the processes. So, and then we continue to evaluate and expand. One of the next things that we're working on is kind of having a data governance community of practice. We used to have community of interest, but I wanted to launch a community of practice. That way we can be connected to all of the agencies as they're working on some of these data governance initiatives. And we already have a SharePoint site that has a lot of templates that we developed and pretty good documentation on how to get some of this set up. And it's a resource for other agencies to leverage. So we actually had some deliverables as a result. We also came up with deliverables on clear definitions across these agencies for this subject area. Now we'll figure out what the next subject area is across the agencies. Questions?
Nothing coming across on chat right now, but we're continuing to watch for those, everyone that's on. We've got everyone muted, but we're looking for questions to come across on chat. One question I've got for you, Elena, how would you describe or identify any barriers that you've encountered in this entire initiative, and how did you overcome those barriers?
Yeah, I had I had a couple, but one of them was when the business leaders, I was having a meeting with them, and then maybe I got to the next level down, especially with policy folks, they know their data folks. So they were pushing really, really hard. Well, we need our data person in here. We need our data person in here. And that was definitely a challenge because I wanted them in there, but I didn't want them in there at that time. So I invited them in just so that they could listen and observe, and they realized why they weren't supposed to be coming. And then I brought them in so that they could hear the conversation, because I think that part is the part that's also missing. You get the IT project manager that maybe gets the scope and requirements, and maybe they might get some information from the business. Rarely do we hear from the business directly about what their vision and ideas are, what they're expecting to see. Let's see.
Very good. We do have a question here, Elena, from Jeff.
Yeah.
Were these initiatives funded by a specific budget appropriation, or did they get funded out of ongoing operations?
That is a great question, and the funding sources came from three different. For MnDOT, I think that they actually did request funding specifically for the governance, and the way that that's why I mentioned the business data catalog. They used the business data catalog to build out their data governance structure, which I thought was pretty smart. So that's what, with DNR, I think it was at the project level, so they included, so I think some costs for the project for data governance. For the cross-agency initiative, it was just embedded as part of the services being provided from the two agencies, and then the resources that were allocated was as part of the Olmstead plan, because this is just part of what they needed to do. And if we're looking at the data, I'm not sure where those funding came from, but I know that some of that cost was shared across MnDOT and the Data Practices Agency, because they felt like this was an important initiative. They didn't want to get hung up on the funding aspect of it. And we kept it small, and we leveraged the resources that were assigned as much as we could. So that's why I felt like a lot of prep work needed to be done so that we could maximize the use of the people's time when we did get them in the room. But that's a great question. That's one of the barriers or struggles in getting something going enterprise-wide, which is why, for me, one of the next steps is the community of practice, because maybe we can start building on some of this and building synergy so that we can get specific programs set up across the state. But we needed to start somewhere, and it seems like it's been working in different areas and varying degrees of success, but these three were definitely successful. So, any other questions?
Very good. That is all the questions we have at this point.
So I just want to read this last, the IT benefits, because I don't want people to think that I don't like IT, and it's not IT. That's not what I'm saying, because I'm in IT. So, but the IT benefit, of course, is easier data integration, definitions on data elements and standards, and they're predefined by the business, not by the system that was built in maybe 10, 15 years ago. We actually get to leverage newer technology around like EAM and Enterprise Service Bus and all this other latest and greatest technology that's coming out. We get to reuse of people, processes, and roles, expertise. So this isn't like we're hiring a bunch of new people to do this. Is making sure that we're clarifying within the business and building that bridge between IT and the business to have them tell us what these around some of this data governance, at least for this piece. Now, in the DMBOK, that doesn't mean the business is for all of it, because some of it is very clearly specific to IT. But as far as definitions and subject areas, and you start with the business, and then it will permeate out from there to the IT piece. So, any other questions?
Nothing coming across on chat, but Elena, I think we have covered quite a bit of ground this afternoon, and we're a little bit past. I think we'll move on to the close here, but thank you very much for coming and presenting to us, and we hope you'll come back again and give us an update on progress, maybe more agencies coming into your initiative here, maybe more on your data stewards and how you're cultivating them, that kind of thing, maybe sometime in the future. But we really appreciate you being here, and everyone on the call, thank you for being here. Again, we'll publish this webinar, and we'll publish the Q&A. Here is Elena's contact information, and she has graciously agreed to answer any additional questions that may come across. And please stay tuned to NASCIO. We will have more webinars like this coming across on our data management working group, and we're also continuing to recruit volunteers. So if you'd like to come and speak to us about what you're doing with data management, your Chief Data Officer program, your Data Steward program, please come and present to us. My contact information is right here, and we'd love to hear from you. So Elena, again, thank you so very much.
Thank you.
And we'll go ahead and close this call, and wish you all a wonderful afternoon, and we'll see you soon, okay?
All right.